Vietnam of the early 1960s is a nation marred by deep ideological division and political instability. Having driven out the French just years earlier, General Ho Chi Minh puts his dream of a unified communist Vietnam into military action against the democratic South. In 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution passes effortlessly through the U.S. Congress and the Senate, giving President Lyndon Johnson the go-ahead to wage an undeclared war on North Vietnam. By 1967, there are 500,000 American troops fighting in Vietnam. They are assisted by constant airstrikes, facilitated through the use of aircraft carriers, including the USS Forrestal, stationed in the Gulf of Tonkin. The Forrestal is on its very first combat mission. It will also be its last. July 28, 1967. Since its arrival in the Gulf of Tonkin just 3 days earlier, the aircraft carrier the USS Forrestal has played a vital role in launching intensive American airstrikes into North Vietnam.
The carrier has kind of evolved into being kind of like the forward arm of a defense establishment. These are the striking units with their escorts, and other vessels are the spear point of any kind of a naval operation.
Under the command of Captain John Beeling, the Forrestal is quite literally a floating city, with a complement of 80 fighter jets and 3 aircraft hangar bays and over 5,000 men on board. One of them is 20-year-old seaman James Root.
There were more people on that ship than there were in my hometown. The flight deck covers 4.5 acres approximately. It's 1,086 feet long. It's 90 feet from the flight deck to the waterline, to give you some perspective. If you took the ship and stood it up on end, it's about the same size as the Empire State Building. It's huge. We were steaming about 20 miles off the coast of North Vietnam. Basically what we were doing, we were flying alpha strikes. That's every plane that would fly loaded as much ordnance and fuel on that plane to make it strike. And we shot them off about every 4 to 6 hours, depending on how fast we could get things turned over.
Late in the evening of July 28th, under the cover of darkness, an ammunition supply ship restocks the dwindling supply of bombs aboard the Forrestal. Among those unloading and stowing the explosives on the loading deck is Seaman Kenneth Kilmeyer.
My division, which was part of the deck division, had received ammunition from an ammunition ship that came alongside of us.
While the munitions are being unloaded, Gun Boss Commander Chisholm discovers a cause for concern.
Me and the fire marshal were waltzing up and down the hangar bays as the armor was coming on board. And that's when these deadly 1,000-pound bombs came on. 26 came on. Commander Chisholm notified the captain that they were World War II variety and he wanted to send them back.
Concerned about the older munitions volatility, Captain John Beeling makes a request to have the World War II ordnance removed from his ship.
The captain got on the phones to the captain of the ammo ship, and the ammo ship captain told him, "It's your fair share, take them and get rid of them."
Seaman James Root is part of the flight deck crew assigned to unload the 20-year-old ordnance.
There was ordnance everywhere. You know, it's amazing that we got it all stored away in its magazines before we started flight operations. We broke away from our replenishments just hours prior to the starting to load up for the first alpha strike of the day.
At daybreak on July 29th, the first strike jets for North Vietnam. It is loaded with 13 of the 26 World War II vintage bombs. The second strike, armed with the 13 remaining bombs, prepares for takeoff. Among those involved in the second strike that day are fighter pilots John S. McCain and Robert Browning, who proceed to their waiting planes. In the ship's mess hall, Seaman Ken Kilmeyer takes a moment to write a letter home. Below deck, Seaman James Root decides to retire after his work on the night shift.
It was a quiet time. Just finished loading for that first one, the first launch. I had a couple hours of downtime, so I read a little bit and went to bed and fell asleep instantly.
Browning and McCain complete their final pre-flight checks as the first plane of the second strike prepares for takeoff. Then, something goes terribly wrong. Upon ignition, flame fires from the engine of the A-4 Seahawk in what is known as a hot start. The flame ignites a missile on the wing of the plane behind it. The missile flies across the flight deck, striking Lieutenant Commander McCain's fighter jet, rupturing his fuel tank and causing hundreds of gallons of jet fuel to flood the deck.
The exhaust from the rocket, of course, it went right through the belly tank. It didn't blow up, but its rocket motor ignited the fuel. So that just blew all that burning jet plane fuel back through the rest of the wing. I was getting ready to launch.
The pilots and ground crew suddenly find themselves surrounded by a giant wall of flame. McCain and Browning evacuate their planes immediately amidst the sudden inferno. Deck Chief Gerald Ferrier instantly grabs a fire extinguisher and rushes into the blaze to prevent it from spreading.
He attempted to put the first 1,000-pounder that was dropped into a belly tank of gas that was ignited, and he attempted to put it out with a PKP extinguisher.
Captain Beeling immediately sounds the general quarters alarm. Men below begin to respond to the alarm, among them leading Petty Officer First Class Milt Crutchley.
Our radar room was located just inboard of the one gun sponson. So when fire went on the flight deck, my first response was, well, I'm going to go see what's going on. And I went out the hatch to climb up on top of the gun mounts.
The general alarm, which is a bong, 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 all hands man your battle stations, your general quarters stations.
Below decks, many think that the general quarters alarm is a drill and disregard it.
I got used to hearing that so much as a drill that when they actually sounded it saying this is not a drill, it didn't register. And I really literally rolled over. The second time it went off, obviously then instinct starts kicking in from your training. Out of the bunk, shoes on, clothes on, grab my shirt, running up the first set of stairs.
On deck, fire crews attempt to douse the flame with a combination of conventional water hoses and a firefighting substance known as fog foam.
It's spread over the top of burning fuel or fuel so it doesn't ignite, takes the oxygen away, starving it from oxygen, therefore not letting it burn.
But water from the hoses washes the fog foam away. Unable to contain the fire with water hoses, fire crews can't prevent the flames from spreading. Temperatures around the World War II issue bombs continue to climb. July 29, 1967. Fire sweeping across the flight deck of the aircraft carrier USS Forrestal catches many of its crew by surprise. 90 seconds after the fire starts, the inevitable happens. Rising temperatures cause a 1,000-pound bomb to explode.
And the first explosion went off and literally blew three of us that were on the stairs from the percussion back down the stairs. And I'm thinking to myself, it's happening, very fast. I'm thinking, this is not right.
Some of the shrapnel went from all the way aft where the first explosion went all the way to the bow of the ship. And when you figure that the ship's a little over 1,000 feet long, that was a pretty good distance from one end to the other for a piece of shrapnel to go flying. And it was actually killed the guy that hit up on the bow.
Deck Chief Gerald Ferrier is never seen again.
The first 1,000-pounder went off, and they never even found a piece of him. He attempted to put the fire out with a PKP extinguisher, which is, in a lot of people's opinion, ridiculous. And like I say, he did something on his own because he was trained to do it.
Miraculously, pilots McCain and Browning make it through the inferno with only minor shrapnel wounds.
John was able to crawl out of his aircraft and escape the flames forward till they were sweeping aft. He wasn't injured seriously at all.
Seconds after the first, the second 1,000-pound bomb explodes, killing those rushing to man the fire hoses. Many of the crew below believe the ship is under attack.
We really had no idea what was going on initially. We knew there was a fire, but we didn't know what started the fire. And then there was a bomb blast, so you didn't know what started that either.
9 bombs erupt over the course of only a few minutes, leaving the aft end of the flight deck consumed in flame. The explosions leave gaping holes in the flight deck, allowing the spilling jet fuel and unsecured bombs to fall into the lower decks.
One bomb fell in another hole, chain reaction, just kept on exploding down and down. And then the fuel fell inside the bomb holes. You know, I mean, it cut a 3-inch armor-plated steel like a knife through butter.
And when that first bomb blast went off, that opened up the flight deck, and that's what let it inside the ship. It was like a fiery waterfall going back down into the 03 level below us, which of course that's where most of the night shift were asleep.
Many of those from the night shift sleeping in their bunks below deck never know what hit them.
A lot of them were caught right in their bunks. The bodies were burnt so bad that you couldn't tell if the man was a white man, a Caucasian, a black man, or an Indian, or you just couldn't tell. The bodies were so badly charred, it was just like black ash.
Men en route to their general quarters stations are diverted to fight the fires that now blaze on the flight deck and in the hangar bays.
I remember seeing people still scrambling, fire hoses that were, still pumping water through them that had no nozzle on the end of it. They were trying to contain as much of the fire as they could in certain areas. They had, by this time, moved all of the good aircraft that they had, either pushed them over the side or moved them forward on the ship to get them out of the line of fire. There was shrapnel everywhere. There were parts of planes everywhere.
James Root makes his way to his general quarters station, but is diverted by a senior officer as he reaches the hangar deck.
He grabbed me by the scuff of the neck and hired 2 other men to go back into the hangar deck and start pulling ammo off a plane that we had just loaded the night before.
Jerry Johnson is also diverted to help fight the fire on deck.
I saw lots of black smoke, lots of confusion, lots of screaming and hollering.
Others manage to arrive at their general quarters stations to await orders. Milt Crutchley and fellow crew members Ron Grayson and Joe Labine are in Hangar Bay 3 as fire begins to box them in.
We probably should have abandoned our general quarters station a lot sooner than we did, but we waited for word from the powers that be up in combat to tell us to abandon that area before we left. So the 3 of us stuck it out, and by the time they said it was okay to leave, it was too late to leave. We had fire above us, and we had fire behind us. We had fire out in the hangar deck, which was just inboard of us.
Captain Beeling sends a distress signal to all ships in the area and orders anything explosive jettisoned from the Forrestal. Ken Kilmayer is diverted from his general quarters station to assist efforts in the hangar bay.
There is total movement in this hangar bay to get aircraft moved forward that were back aft. Some aircraft were jettisoned, and I immediately started helping in that. Everybody was helping.
James Root is also in the hangar bay, doing things he never thought he'd do in the rush to jettison explosives.
We were breaking every rule that we were taught on how to handle ordnance, literally dropping it on the ground, pulling the fuses out of them and rolling bombs off the side of the ship, things you shouldn't have been doing. But under the circumstances, we had no other way of doing it.
Firefighting efforts begin below decks as men scramble to contain the flames from spreading any further.
They needed help back aft in Hangar Bay 3. I went back there along with some other guys from my division. I got an OBA, and I got on a hose team.
The fires raging on the hangar deck begin to cause complications for those fighting fires on the flight deck.
We were just trying to put the individual fires out, but we still had a hard time advancing because of the raging infernos on the 03 level. When you put a fire under a steel deck and you're standing on it on the 04 level, what do you think's happening to your feet? They're getting kind of hot. The soles of your shoes are starting to vulcanize to the flight deck. That was why a lot of salt water was put on the flight deck.
This attempt to cool the flight deck actually makes matters worse.
We had a battery locker up there. Battery acid and salt water don't mix. It produces chlorine gas. You only can take a couple of deep breaths of that and you're gone. Some sailors actually got killed from the chlorine gas.
Crutchley, Grayson, and Labine are hemmed into their general quarters station by flame. They turn to the only escape route open to them.
The three of us decided to try for the gun sponson because we figured that if nothing else, we could go over the side of the ship and we'd have fresh air, take our chances out there with whatever. And that's when we discovered that one of the guys that did maintenance on the crane, there was a guy hanging on the hook.
Crutchley and the others attempt to get the stranded man off the crane.
One of the arresting gear cable had been blown down from the flight deck across the gun sponson and over onto this crane arm. So the three of us decided, well, let's slide down that cable, get on the crane, and we'll get that guy up off the hook, and then we'll decide what we're going to do from there.
As they reach the stranded sailor on the crane, other ships in the area arrive to aid the stricken Forrestal, including the USS Rupertus and the USS Diamond Head.
It was about that time one of the destroyers pulled up alongside, and they wanted to know if we were going to jump. And most likely the three of us would have been sucked into somebody's screws. And that would have been the last anybody would have seen of us.
Milt Crutchley and his mates try to figure out how to get to safety as they dangle on the crane hook 50 feet above the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin.
We realized that the control arm for the crane ran directly from the flight deck down to the hook and had two little control cables on either side of the control arm. And to us, it sort of looked like, the stairway to heaven. So I told Ron and Joe, go up the control arm to the flight deck and just hold on to the cables and walk up out here.
After a precarious crossing, the men finally make it to the flight deck.
And we hadn't gotten 60 seconds away from that control arm when one of the last fuel tanks blew and covered the area where we had just been with burning jet plane fuel. So another 60 seconds and we'd all been, burned alive or whatever.
12 hours after the fire has broken out, the Forrestal blaze is finally brought under control. Smaller fires smolder below decks, which are so intensely hot, crews have difficulty fighting them. The wounded Forrestal begins to steam towards Subic Bay in the Philippines. En route, many of the men literally collapse from exhaustion.
A lot of the crew were up all night, worked harder than probably a lot of them ever worked in their lives, and they were exhausted. And the after third of the ship had been burned out, so they didn't have any place to go to sleep.
The body count yields 134 dead and 64 wounded as the Forrestal sets in for repairs. With the immediate danger of the fire behind them, crew members begin to feel the full effect of the disaster.
We were safe, we were heading to port, we lost a lot of people. The senses start to kick in and you have the fire odors, fog foam odors, flesh odors. Those things affect you today.
And the first sense you have is a great degree of relief that, hey, we were lucky, we got out of there with our lives. But then you start feeling, why did we get out of there? And somebody else, 100, 150 feet away from you, they don't. So then you get this kind of a feeling of guilt. Eventually that feeling of guilt turns more into a feeling of, I guess indebtedness is the only word I use, that you owed something to the guys that did get killed.
In the aftermath of the tragedy, several important lessons emerge from the Forrestal disaster.
The hangar deck, for example, now has greater fire doors that react more quickly and are paid more respect to, I'd say, as far as that's concerned, so that they don't jam and that they're ready to isolate.
Firefighting training courses also become mandatory for every sailor entering the Navy, not just designated firemen. Yet for the hundreds of survivors, that fateful July day in 1967 lives on, serving for many as a constant reminder of the preciousness and fragile gift of life.
If we lived through that, there must have been a reason, and there's something that we have to do yet, and that's why we made it out of there and somebody else didn't. Their job was done, but ours isn't, and then you start trying to figure out, what is it that I have to do, and why am I still here?
And you are motivated to honor those who weren't as lucky as myself.
We dedicate this reef to all our shipmates from the Forrestal, and may God continue to bless them.
Children that never saw a father, wives that lost their husbands, wives that briefly married crewmen that never got to complete the American dream. It's a motivator. Makes you want to work harder to help them complete their story. And not let it hold you back.